Welcome to Calm Water Crisis Consulting's webinar recording with the title Capture Your Experiences from COVID-19 Crisis, where we look into the post-incident evaluation process and I provide you with tips and tricks and professional insights. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on Capture Your Experiences from COVID-19 Crisis, the first in a series of 7 webinars that we're going to run over the course of May and June. If somebody could just write in the chat box whether you hear me loud and clear, it would be great. Just want to make sure. Perfect. Thanks, Jesper. Good. So why don't we just get to it? I'll enlarge the slides so you don't have to look too much at me. So should be like this. And I hope that the picture quality is fine as well. So as I said, this is the first one of 7, where we go through various topics related to crisis management. And the session today is scheduled to last for about 45 minutes. I will be speaking for the first 25-30 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussions afterwards. A couple of practical details. You are all muted by default. If you want to, you can ask questions, and I hope we get an active dialogue. The questions you ask by using the Ask a Question button in the bottom of the screen. That's the best way to get the questions in, and then we use the chat box for any technical issues there might be, if any, as we go along. So I hope that's okay with everybody, and then we can move on. You will be able to get a recording of the session here after the session. If you log onto the webinar as you did when you started today, you will also get the download opportunity. Some of you probably know me quite well by now, and there's also some that don't. But let me just introduce myself briefly. I've been working my entire professional life actually in this intersection between being as prepared as possible and handling the unexpected. This I've done both in the maritime industry, where I've spent a number of years with Maersk Line, doing everything from area operations in the Eastern Mediterranean to global operations, and lately also developing and implementing a full-fledged crisis management system in Maersk Line, the same system as being used today. Sorry. I also have a military background from the Danish Navy as an officer for 15 years, which is, you could say, the hardcore part of preparing for crisis, hoping that it never happens. But I think that has given me a good solid background. One of the central pieces that I've learned over the years is that things are not necessarily black and white when you talk about crisis management, and particularly commercial companies. It's super important that you have a balance between operational and commercial requirements, both in your planning of your crisis management setup, but definitely also in how you execute on it. It's a little bit easier if you're in the military or in a public organization where key focus is maybe less commercial but more operational. But enough about me. If you want to talk more about that, to my surprise, you can reach out to me afterwards. So the headline for today is Capture Your Experiences from the COVID-19 Crisis. And if you look at the overall crisis management process, then this is maybe the last thing that you would get to, which is the post-incident analysis. This is something you get to after the crisis. But I thought it was a good place to start the webinar series, because we are maybe, hopefully, crossing our fingers, towards the end of the current COVID-19 crisis, or at least getting out of crisis mode and getting into a more business continuity where we still deal with some of the issues. So that's why I thought it was a good place to start. So what I will do today is I will go through a little bit the background for why is the post-incident analysis an important part of crisis management, and also go through the process and give you some tips and tricks on what is relevant to look at when you do this. Of course, I cannot tell you exactly how you're going to run it in your company, but hopefully I can give you some inspiration as to what you could put into your plan and how you then could benefit from it. And let me just turn my script here. So why is it that we bother at all? Well, there's no doubt that COVID-19 at least is the biggest crisis that has hit the world since, basically since World War II. And even though it's impacted our personal lives quite a lot, it has also impacted our business life quite significantly, and not only here in Denmark, but definitely across the globe, with all the complications that brings too. One of the issues is that when the government, they are imposing regulations on our ability to move around freely, it also has a direct impact on our business lives. So what in this case might have started as a public health crisis has now turned into a serious business crisis, with enterprises seeing markets disappearing, production possibilities being reduced, supply chains being impacted, and basically it just takes longer time to do the same that you did before. I actually got a quite interesting view in the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis from one of my former Maersk colleagues, who said that, well, for them, the COVID-19 crisis was basically a non-event from a crisis perspective, because operationally, the ships were sailing, ports were operating, and everything was good. The problem was that the markets had disappeared, so it was more commercial crisis than an operational crisis. And I think that probably illustrates quite well how the COVID-19 crisis has changed from being a health crisis to a commercial crisis that now also has operational implications on what we do. So regardless of what industry we're in, I think we can safely say that everybody has been impacted. And if we look back on how most enterprises have been dealing with the COVID-19 crisis since the outbreak, well, basically since beginning of January, at least globally, then there are likely things that we would have wished that we have done differently if we had known things that we know now, or at least what were the good things that we did. And this is actually what all this is about today, is how can we take those experiences that we have during a crisis, capture it, learn from it, and then make sure that we're better prepared for the next crisis. Because there will be a next crisis. Might not be a pandemic, might be something else, but there's no doubt there's going to be a crisis again. So we need to capture both the learnings we did specifically to a pandemic, but we also need to take the learnings on how did we deal with crisis from an organizational point of view, how good was our plans, etc. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of you might be familiar with a normal crisis process, but I normally say that there's three phases in a crisis. There's the preparation phase. So you prepare yourself to deal with the crisis, and this is the phase where you do the initial analysis, where you map out your risks and you make your plan based on the risk picture that you have. And then you exercises and you learn from the exercise and you adjust your plans. This is a continuous improvement cycle, and we will get back to that a little bit later. And this is everything you do before a crisis happens. Then you move into the handling phase when a crisis happens. And this is where you activate your team, you activate the plans, you act and respond to the crisis, and you communicate internally and externally. In this phase, you focus entirely on the crisis. And then at one point, you de-escalate, the crisis is over, you move into business continuity or straight into normal business, and then you move into the evaluation phase. And this is a part that a lot of people, they tend to forget, because once the crisis is over, it's very easy to just move into normal business, and there's a lot of priorities there. But I would claim that the post-evaluation is probably, from a crisis perspective, the most important part, because this is where you learn and make sure that your plans are reflecting the learnings you have, so that the next time there's a crisis, you don't make the same mistakes that you did during this crisis. Assuming you did some, you probably did, and there will be things in all crises that we can improve on. So this model is good to remember when we move through the presentation here. If you deploy a crisis management structure in your business, then there's a lot of value in it, and it's very likely that you will see the value coming up straight away. A lot of people think that crisis management, that's something that, first of all, it's super expensive, and you only need it if an incident happens. And I meet a lot of potential customers saying that, yeah, we've never had an incident, so we don't really need it because crises don't hit us. Well, maybe not, and hopefully not. But you can actually benefit also if you don't have a crisis, because just being able to tell your customers that, hey, if something happens, I'm actually prepared. I've taken the right preventive actions based on my risk assessment to reduce the likelihood of incidents happening. And if they happen, I'm also prepared because I have a good and clear plan that gives me the fast response time. I'm probably shorter time in crisis mode, and I'm focusing on reducing the impact on the customers. And the customers, they're going to reward you for that afterwards. Because if you have a better track record, and think about it yourself, who would you like to do business with? Those that have it under control or those that don't? And I can tell you from my experience running crisis management organizations that doing it well gives you a lot of recognition for customers and external partners. So just by having it and demonstrating that you can do it is actually creating a lot of value. And happy customers, that's more income and higher share price. So it all leads to something that people like. Just keep this in mind. So let's try to move into the post-incident analysis process. So for me, it consists of 6 phases. Some of them overlapping a little bit, but I think we can safely say that these 6 phases is what we're going to focus on. And like with everything else in crisis management, then a structured approach, that's what we need, and that also goes for the post-incident analysis. You can also, with confidence, say that this is not rocket science, and you're absolutely probably all done kinds of evaluations on projects or business development or other things, and the logic here is not very much different from that. And those familiar with continuous improvement cycles and things like that will probably also have seen a good structure here. But that being said, that if you have the process structured, you have it described in your crisis management plan, and the crisis management plan is embedded in the organization, then it's also more likely that people are actually going to follow it once the crisis is over, and not just jump into doing normal business and forgetting this part where you actually learn from what you did. So we will go through each of these steps, and I'll try to give you some insights on each of them. So let's move into the collect data. The collecting of data is important, because if you don't have the data, then what is it you're going to review? And actually collecting data starts already from the second that the crisis starts. It's not something you start doing only after the crisis. It's actually something you do during the process, where you collect all the information that gets to you and gets to the crisis management team as you go along. And the most important part of this is the crisis log. A crisis log is something that you start the minute that the crisis is declared. The first thing you do is you prepare a crisis log. You enter all the essential initial information, and then you use this log as a narrative to write down all the decisions, all the actions, all the discussions, all the insights that you get in a chronological order, so that you know what it is that you have been discussing, what you had decided, who's been given actions, and you have an opportunity to follow up. Because in the midst of a crisis, it's very easy to oversee things and forget to follow up on actions. But if you have it in your log, then you can always return back and say, oh, what was it that we decided, and have we done that? So the crisis log is going to be important both during the crisis and also after the crisis. I would assume that after each crisis management team meeting, you also do minutes of meetings. Make sure that you collect those. Communication messages done internally or externally to media or employees, they're also good to collect when you review the communication part of a crisis, just to see, did we do the right thing, and did it have the intended impact that we were expecting. If you get documents related to the incident from internal or external parties, make sure you save them in a common place. If they're physical, of course, that you have a stack you keep them in, or if they are online, that you have a folder dedicated to the specific event, so that when you get to the review session, you have a chance to review the documents as well. Then, of course, you note down all the people that are involved, both the crisis team, functional experts, other people in the organization, external people, everybody that has been involved somehow and played a role is important to note down. And that is something that the log keeper also should make sure that you keep a list of. Mail correspondence is something that we see more and more during crises, where a lot of the communication happens on mails and not just on telephone. I can only recommend that as part of your crisis setup, you also have a dedicated incident mail address or mailbox, so that all in and outgoing messages related to the crisis goes into this mailbox, because it makes it a lot easier afterwards. And also during the crisis, it helps you making sure you capture all incident-related mails. I've seen so many times that people are using their personal mail queue, and that means that there are sub-dialogues going on that nobody in the crisis management team necessarily knows about, and also you tend to forget or oversee important messages. So having an incident mailbox ease both handling the incident, but also afterwards when you review it. Then, of course, there's other things that could come in here. That could be weather data. Weather is typically one of the parts of a crisis, maybe not the pandemic as such, but in many other incidents, weather plays a role. So collecting weather data, both during the crisis, but also after, is important. Any pictures or video or any other relevant material. So as you can see, this is just an example of things that could be important to collect. For the specific incident, there could be other things, but make sure you collect it because it's important for the review session. And when we get to the final part of the process, where you make up a report, you also need to have a lot of this. And you will be surprised how easy people, they forget what they talked about during the crisis. So having all these data points as reference is quite useful. The next step is then the review session itself. And this is where you bring together everybody who's been involved, depending a little bit on how many it is, because you don't want to be too many either, if that brings down the level of productivity during the review session. But there's a couple of people that are super important to have in the review session, and that is, of course, the core crisis management team. Whether that's 5 or 7 or 8 people in your organization, it doesn't really matter, but they should all be there because they have a lot of insights and things that they can contribute with. If there's been any executives involved, either for escalation purposes or that you've given updates to, make sure they participate as well. Some of them might be reluctant to spend time on it, but I think you have a task there to explain to them the value that doing a proper review session will give to the organization. Any functional experts or any other people as required should participate in this session. But again, depending a little bit on your facilities and how many you can be, make sure you select the relevant ones at least. But you will actually be surprised when you start bringing in people that are maybe a little bit further away from the core team, what views they have on what worked well and what didn't work well, and they might actually be different from what you think yourself. So don't overly look people that initially might not seem like the most relevant ones. So when to do it? I would say do it right after the crisis when fresh in mind. People, they tend to forget very fast. So if you wait more than 48 hours, then in today's business environment, you're already on to the next thing, and then it becomes very difficult to gather people. So you need to capture them while they still have the crisis fresh in mind, and they can remember what happened, and they are not deep dived into other stuff. So make sure you schedule it right away. In many companies that I've been talking to, it's the head of the crisis management that facilitate the crisis review session. That could work, but the thing is that this person also sits with a lot of observations, and they might not come to the surface if you use them. And also there will be people sitting in those sessions that are reluctant to speak their mind. If it's managed by maybe a head of crisis management that are running a very tight ship and not allowing people to speak freely, then it could be difficult. So use an independent facilitator. It could be somebody else from your company that has the experience to facilitate larger groups, or you can bring in third-party facilitators, people like me or other, to facilitate this. I think this is money well spent. I also suggest you take the outset in what worked well. Human nature is we like to talk about what worked well and give ourselves a little pat on the shoulder. So if you start off the session by talking about what actually worked well, you also loosen up people and you create an environment where it's easier to speak your mind, and then you slowly can work your way into what didn't work so well. Typically, it also comes implied in what worked well. Then between the lines, you can also read what didn't work well, and then it's easier to address. So this is a good technique that you can follow. Then make sure you hear everybody out. Don't conclude on what people are saying before they actually told the whole story. Might take a little bit longer, but I think it's important that you hear people out. Then you should capture all the learnings, and you can see an example on the right-hand side here of learnings that could be worth noting down. So if you take the first one, this was actually just a positive one, right? So the threat level assessment in the incident was correct. So there's no action required, but it was actually one of the things that worked well. And we could conclude that, okay, in this particular case, then people were actually following the assessment process and managed to assess it correct. Another one could be that the time elapsed from local incident happened to CMT notification, that this was too long. And here, you can talk about potential actions based on the learnings in the review session, if there is suggestions to it, and then put that down on the notes from the meeting. The idea is that a learning, if it's something that didn't work well, have an action on how to get it to work, whether that is a change of plans or a change of procedures or something else. It doesn't really matter as long as it has an action and somebody is assigned to it and follow up on it. And that brings us into the next thing. So where do you do all that? Well, you need to have a learning and actions log. As part of your crisis management plan, the learnings and actions log should be a log that you keep, and it should be managed by the crisis manager who maintains the log. Make sure that all the actions that are agreed upon, they are followed up upon, and that you get whatever action implemented. If it's adjustments to plans, that it gets implemented, or if preventive actions, that they are moved forward. And then you use the continuous improvement cycles after you identified them and planned it, that you execute them, and then you review also how these changes to the process they actually work. So it's not enough just to put it into the plans. You also need to double check as part of the next crisis situation or the next exercise you do that these changes actually works. So this continuous improvement cycle, this is the mentality that we would like to get into this process. One thing that is not necessarily related to how the crisis plan is constructed, but to the incident itself, is the root cause analysis. And the root cause analysis is important because we want to know what happened. We want to know how it happened, and we want to know why it happened. And are there things that we can do to prevent it from happening again? Related to the COVID-19, it's maybe not the most important part, because from an enterprise point of view or public organization, that's not for us to find out. This is more on a national level or even a World Health Organization level to figure out why did COVID-19 happen. But from an enterprise point of view, we could, if it was something else, let's say it was a fire in a warehouse or a flooding of a warehouse or a employee being kidnapped while traveling in Mexico or things like that, then of course we want to look into the root cause and figure out, was there something we could have done differently, and could we prevent it from happening again? Maybe different travel policy if it's a kidnapping in Mexico, or should we have fire alarm sensors or things like that. So this root cause analysis, and there's a lot of methodologies into how you do that, whether you do it internally or you get external experts, insurance experts, or other to do the root cause analysis. But I think it's important to do it. And whatever conclusions comes out of this root cause analysis should be added to the post-incident report that you do. And then, of course, if there are preventive actions you can take, you should get those implemented as well. And the post-incident report is the last component in the process here. And why do we want to do a post-incident report? Well, for me, it's about making sure that we knowledge share. So if we write a report afterwards where we capture the incident and what we did and the learnings we had, then we can use that as knowledge sharing, both between those that are involved in crisis management, but we can also do it to educate executives, the board, and give them the confidence that, hey, we actually, this was the crisis incident, we actually did it this way, it turned out to be good, but there was a couple of things that didn't work, and then we work with that. So you can use it also as a stakeholder tool internally, but then definitely also use it to record your experiences for future reference. When you get a couple of months down the road and you get another pandemic situation, you might not remember everything you did. But if you have the post-incident report, you have a reference you can go back to and say, hey, what was it we did here? And what can we do? Can we do some of that again? I also use it to track the costs of incidents, because everybody is always asking, so what was the cost impact of an incident? And that's often very hard to put money on because it's maybe also consequential damages down the road. But I think you need to try to put a figure on it to see what an incident costs. And I think for analytical purposes, I think it's pretty good. It's also good for as arguments for this discussion you probably will face at some point, which is why should we spend money on a crisis management setup when we don't have many crises? And let's just say a crisis costs several $1 million. If you can save 5% by having an effective crisis management setup, you have more than justified why you should have the setup in place, because already there you will save a lot of money. How should you structure it? I've given an example of how I structure them when I do post-incident reports. I always start off with an executive summary because there will be people that don't have time to read the whole report. So a 1-2-pager that gives the summary is pretty good. I describe the incidents. So what was it that happened? I also spent some time putting in the evaluation of crisis level and activation of the crisis team, because this is actually a quite important part of the crisis management process, is that you assess, if you have a tiered model, you assess the crisis level, and if you just have a flat, every crisis is dealt with the same way, then how did you activate the crisis team? And here I can make a little commercial for one of the following webinars where we will look into tiered crisis models and how that can be used also to reduce the number of times that the global or maybe the overarching crisis management team is involved, and how you can push some of this responsibility further down the organization. So stay tuned for that. The timeline of events, and this is where the crisis log becomes relevant, because this is the core activities from this crisis log that you put in here. All the communication highlights, so what medias did we talk to, how many television appearances, how much social media interaction, were there interviews with newspapers, and how did we also communicate to the staff. So the internal communication and how was that perceived. And here it would be good to go out and ask some of the employees on how they perceive the internal communication. You can eventually use your communication department for that. Then business impact, both short-term and maybe longer term. Might be difficult to put money on the longer term, but here you can maybe do an assessment on it. And that brings down to the cost assessment. So all the actual costs that you know from the incidents. As an example, when I was in Maersk Line, we had a fire on a ship in the Indian Ocean, and there was towage cost, there was firefighting costs, there was extra terminal costs, there were husbandry services in ports, discharging containers, etc. Right. So a lot of cost components that went into a crisis like this that we try to capture. And then, of course, the root cause investigation and the learnings and the actions from the review. And I think if you follow this content structure, you come all the way around all the areas that you need to cover in a post-incident review. So this is the process, and I think there's some key takeaways here that I would like you to walk away with from this short introduction. First of all, the crisis log. The crisis log is super essential, and as you can hear, both during the crisis but also afterwards. Collect the data both during the crisis and immediately after, so that it don't disappear. And make sure that as your close-up meeting before you scale down from a crisis situation, that you collect data there before everybody is running off left, right, and center. Conduct the review session immediately after, or at least within the first 48 hours, and take out set in what worked. Capture the learnings, follow up on them. Follow up on the actions, making sure that it's implemented, and then summarize it all in the post-incident report. The good thing about this process is you can use it for more than just a crisis review. You can also do it for a post-exercise evaluation minus the root cause analysis, because you need to do the exact same thing every time you've done a larger exercise or even a smaller exercise. You use components of this process. So that makes it quite relevant both before and after. So with that, we've reached the end. This is what I wanted to talk about in this short webinar. If you want to talk more, you're more than welcome to contact me, and I can also again advertise for the remaining parts of the series. Follow us on LinkedIn or go visit my website where you can find a link for registration for the coming events. And now I'll open the floor for questions. Put in your questions. If you have anything you want me to talk more about, I'll be more than happy to use the remaining 10 minutes answering questions. Oops. I'll just give it a few seconds to see if questions come in. And while I'll wait for that, then the next webinar is on Tuesday, the 19th, and the topic here is risk assessment. How do you know your operational risks? So I'll give an introduction there on a methodology you can use for assessing your risks, your operational risks. It doesn't look like there's any questions coming in. So if that's the case, then I think we'll close the session, and I'll thank you for attending, and I hope that I'll see you all soon again. And if there's anything, reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to take a one-on-one as well. Oops, I think there's a question coming in here. The question is, can you mention any examples and their potential and the impact on results? Les, are you looking for specific crisis examples, or I assume that's the case? Then, well, we've had the pandemic here. That's definitely a crisis, and that has impacted a lot of businesses. Other example of crisis situations could be, and I gave the example of a warehouse. If let's say you're a factory that has a production facility where you have a crisis situation where your warehouse is flooded or there's a fire and you deal with that one, then that could definitely have a huge impact. I had a case with a customer where we did a risk analysis, and one of the things we identified there was that their warehouse was one of their biggest exposures because they were a seafood importing company, and they had a warehouse where they had seafood for approximately 5 to 6 months sale. And if something happened to that warehouse, it would have a huge impact on their business. So if that had happened, it would definitely have been a crisis situation for them, and they would have been forced to do something quite differently than what they're doing today. And here, the impact on their result would have been devastating. That could potentially bring them out of business. Another case could be the example I mentioned with Maersk Line, with a fire in a container when the ship is at sea. Where there's both a huge operational crisis in dealing with the particular event, because it also has a potential human impact on the crew, and the cost of that was, or the direct costs were quite significant because, I mean, the minute you start talking about ships, it starts costing a lot of money. But there was actually also a lot of ripple effects on the overall network. So when we did the cost assessment afterwards, the biggest cost item was actually not the fire itself. It was actually the cost of bringing replacement vessels in and driving that on top of having an idle vessel lying. So that's a couple of examples on crisis. Did that answer your question, Lasse? There's also a question from Jesper on the chat whether the invites for the next one will come out. And yes, they are already. You can already access the full overview if you go to my website. Under news, there's a link to where you can register for all the events. Otherwise, follow me on LinkedIn or Calm Water Crisis Consulting on LinkedIn, then they will come out a week before. The next one will be sent out later today. Thank you very much for participating. We were not that many today, but this was also the first webinar, and let's see if more will join for the next one. I hope to see you all back, and have a fantastic afternoon, and see you soon. Cheers.